researcher called Alfred Maisels, who later became chief economist at UNCTAD. And Alf Maisels was working on a mammoth book on world trade and economic growth. And I still think it's the best book that's been written on the topic, even though it's now 30 years old. He worked for about 4 years with 3 colleagues, and he analyzed all the available world trade statistics from 1899 through to 1959. But it was a mammoth job to try and get them classified by commodities on a comparable basis for about 40 countries. Of course, there were big problems to do that. And so far as it was humanly possible, I think he resolved the main problems, and he came to certain conclusions from his analysis. And this was long before people got the fashionable idea of export-led growth. What Alf Maisel showed in this mammoth analysis of world trade was that catching up countries who were catching up with the leaders in trade generally had a faster rate of growth of exports, and that these exports were very often in new commodities, new industries. So that, for example, Britain, still at the end of the 19th century, had 50% of its exports, still even then, in textiles and clothing, 50% of British exports. Whereas the newcomers, principally Germany and the United States, had a much stronger export specialization in newer commodities, especially electrical machinery and chemicals. And Alf Maisels traced these kinds of connections over this whole 60-year period and showed that there was a relationship, which others had shown before, of course, a strong relationship between growth in the manufacturing industry and GNP growth. But more importantly, he showed there was a strong relationship between manufacturing industry growth and export growth. And he showed that this was important for 3 reasons. First of all, most countries needed economies of scale to achieve efficient levels of production in many commodities. And most home markets were too small to reap the economies of scale that were available. So export markets facilitated the realization of scale economies in many different industries for many countries. This was the first reason why he showed that exporting was extremely important for economic growth. Secondly, firms and industries that were entering the world market had to meet certain competitive levels in order to stay effectively in world markets. And that meant there were competitive pressures to improve performance technically, quality-wise, and in other directions. And finally, the effort to export meant that the introduction of novelty of new products became especially important. So for those 3 reasons, he held that there was a strong connection between exports and industrial growth. Well, if you look at the catching up performance of East Asia and Latin America in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, then I think you can find some very interesting comparisons, highly relevant to what Alfred Maisels did. A lot of people have looked at East Asian growth, the 4 tigers especially, and made comparisons with Latin America. We had very good seminars here from Robert Wade, from Mike Hobday, and many of you have probably read the books by Robert Wade and Miss Amsden about Korea and other East Asian countries. And I don't pretend that I have anything like the depth of knowledge of those people about Korea or other East Asian countries. All my knowledge is really book knowledge and what I've learned from graduate students here. However, I found that most of these accounts of East Asian success, rather surprisingly, ignore the point that Alfred Maisels focused upon, which is the commodity composition of exports and how that changed respectively in Latin America and in East Asia over the past 10 or 20 years. So I want to talk about that And in relation to that changing commodity composition of exports, I want to talk about the infrastructure which makes it possible to introduce new products and to export those successfully. And on that basis, I want to argue that there are developed big differences between what I'm going to call the East Asian national system of innovation and the Latin American national system of innovation. So first of all then, to clear the ground a bit, to abolish one or two myths about East Asia and Latin America. First of all, it is sometimes maintained that the difference between East Asia and Latin America is very long-standing, that the Latin American countries always benefited from natural resource endowment, from strength in raw materials and agriculture, and that East Asia somehow had industrial strength before Latin America. This is definitely not the case, and Alf Mazels, in his book that I mentioned, I apologize to many of you maybe can't see the transparencies, but what this transparency shows is that in 1955, when Alf Mazels prepared this table, the ratio of manufacturing to agricultural net output was far higher in the main Latin American countries, Argentina, Brazil, Mexico, etc., than it was in Asian countries. Frequently 5 or 6 times as high, the ratio of industrial to agricultural net output. And if you look at the per capita level of manufacturing, net value of manufacturing per capita, you can see it was abysmally low in South Korea, Thailand, India, Indonesia. Alf Mazels didn't then have the statistics for Taiwan, but I'm sure they would show a very similar picture. So, in fact, the starting point was that East Asian countries and South Asian countries were far below the level of industrialization of Latin American countries in the 1950s. So they started far behind. So if they are now, as they are, well ahead, having double the per capita income in East Asia and most of the Latin American countries, that's an extraordinary change over a 30-year period from being far behind to being far ahead. So it's an extreme case of rapid catching up and overtaking and forging ahead. And so it's obviously of tremendous interest to development economics and to economics in general to try to explain that catching up process. Well, almost everybody that's looked at this question, the neoliberals, people like Robert Wade, Alice Amsden, almost the World Bank that's looked at the relative performance of these countries, agree on one thing, and that is that exports had a great deal to do with the success of the Four Tigers and more recently of mainland China also in this more rapid growth. So that much is agreed upon. Of course, Robert Wade, Alice Amsden differ greatly from the neoliberals in their interpretation of this. The neoliberals tend to emphasize that the Latin Americans clung to import substitution policies of industrialization longer than the East Asian countries. The neoliberals tend to minimize, and even not to mention, the various forms of protection that existed in the East and still exist in the East Asian countries for a long time. So there are differences in the way the analysis is made, but nevertheless, they all agree exports were extremely important. So, on that basis, if we look at the comparative growth rates, and again, I apologize to those of you who can't see this transparency, it's a World Bank table, and what it shows is that in the 1960s and 70s, from 65 to 1980, if you take 4 big regions of the world, East Asia, South Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Latin America, Then in the 65 to 1980 period, Latin America had rather high growth rates, 5.8% per annum. It was not as fast as East Asia at 7.5% per annum, but nevertheless, most people would say that 5.8% per annum is not a bad rate of growth in that period. So the differences that we're talking about between Latin America and East Asia relate not to that period of the 50s, 60s, 70s. They relate to the 1980s, because it was in the 1980s that the really big divergence became absolutely clear. And you can see that in those of you who can see the transparencies, that in the 1980s, the East Asian growth rate increased above the previous period to nearly 8% per annum from 1980 to 89, whereas the Latin American dropped catastrophically to 1.6%. That's a colossal change. That's why Latin Americans call the 1980s the lost decade. And for putting to per capita terms, that means, of course, that Latin America and Sub-Saharan Africa both had negative per capita income growth, i.e., people were getting absolutely poorer in Latin America and Africa in the 1980s. It was a catastrophic decade for those parts of the world. But in East Asia, they went from strength to strength, and per capita income growth accelerated in East Asia compared with the 50s, 60s, and 70s. Well, that's all the more remarkable if you remember that the 1980s were a period of slower world economic growth and world trade growth, i.e., from about 1973 or 75 onwards, it became more difficult to compete in world markets. It became more difficult to sustain high growth rates. All the countries of Europe, the US, and Japan slowed down in their rate of growth in this period. But in spite of that, these East Asian countries accelerated their rate of growth. Okay, to achieve that, it did mean they had to get very high rates of growth of exports. And indeed, the figures completely confirm what everyone says about the importance of exports for these countries. What the rate of growth of merchandise exports show from 1980 to 1988 is that Hong Kong, Taiwan, South Korea had rates of growth of exports of 15% per annum or more. China had 13% per annum, Singapore 9% per annum, Thailand 12% per annum. The Latin American countries didn't do so badly actually in that period. Brazil made tremendous efforts at exports because of the huge problem of debt payments, as that all the Latin American countries were grappling with this problem of debt repayment. And both Mexico and Brazil, at 6.5% rate of growth of exports per annum, that's a pretty good achievement by most people's standards, certainly by British standards. So it's a very good achievement. But it was less than half the rate of growth of the East Asian giants. Well, if in difficult world trading conditions you have that contrasting performance, there must be something pretty substantial to explain such a difference. And I think that Alfred Meisel was quite right when he pointed to the changing commodity composition of exports as one of the keys to this problem of varying rates of industrial growth. So that if you look at the varying rates of growth of different types of commodity in world trade in this period we're talking about, GATT has made a very good analysis. And GATT have now begun, I think, you can get credit for it, to separate out information technology goods as a separate class within the class of manufacturing exports. And what their analysis shows, the GATT analysis for 1980 to 89, is that by far the most rapid rate of growth of any commodity group was what they call ICT goods, 13% per annum rate of growth, which is very much higher than the average for all manufacturers and far higher than the rate of growth for food, raw materials, and primary commodities. So any country which had a significant proportion of its exports in ICT goods, which is all electronic goods, office machinery, computers, telecommunication equipment, it's that whole group of commodities. Any country which had an export specialization in that group could do, simply by that fact, if all exports are growing at some rate, do far better than a country which was locked in to a slow-growing commodity group. And the problem with many of the Latin American countries was that they were and are locked into much slower-growing commodity groups in world exports. So that, for example, the unfortunate people like Venezuela, who were in oil exports, they did fine in the 1970s, but when oil prices came down, they suffered very badly indeed. Other Latin American countries specializing in steel, food, raw materials, minerals, also were confronted with a world market growing at only 2, 3, 4% per annum. And in those circumstances, to achieve, as Brazil and Mexico did in the 1980s, a growth rate of exports of 6.5% was all the more remarkable achievement, because it meant expanding the share of world exports above the rate of growth of the group as a whole. So what about the commodity composition of exports then in that period for the East Asian countries? Almost all the East Asian countries doubles or more than doubles the proportion of their exports in that fastest growing group of commodities in world trade in the 1980s, information and communication technology goods. So that Japan, which increased its commodity specialization in this group from 14% of total exports to 28% of total Japanese exports, was outstripped actually by Singapore, which increased that share from 14 to 34%. But all the other countries, South Korea, Taiwan, 10%, 22%, Taiwan 14 to 25%, they all achieved an astonishing success in specialization of exports in those fastest growing commodity groups. So that meant their trade specialization in information communication technology goods, and we don't have the figures for services, but the same applies actually in business services based on telecommunications too. That meant that they were very favorably placed in terms of relating trade growth to industrial growth generally. Whereas those countries with export specialization in much less favorable groups had an enormous struggle to cope with the problems of intensified world competition in the 1980s. Okay, well, just to show you a few more illustrations of the success of the East Asian tigers and of China in increasing their world market share based on this very high rate of growth of ICT goods exports in that period, you'll see that whereas Japan increased its world share of exports in the only slightly, from 11 to 12%, the US declined slightly, UK declined considerably. You see that Taiwan, South Korea, mainland China, Hong Kong, and Singapore all nearly doubled their share of world exports of manufactures between 1980 and 89. Brazil also did actually quite well. Brazilian share increased from 0.7% to 0.9% in a tough world market. But of course, the Brazilian export side specialization was so unfavorable that that achievement was overshadowed completely by the achievements of the four tigers. Well, people will say, okay, information communication technology goods, maybe this now represents 20, 30, 35% of total exports of manufacturers from these countries. It's a big share, but it's not the only thing. Perfectly true. It's also true, of course, that these countries did well in exports of other commodities. And most notably, they did extremely well in exports of clothing. Clothing was one of their first specializations before electronics, and they held that position on the whole in world clothing exports. So that Hong Kong is first in the world in share of world's exports of clothing, number one in the world. South Korea is number 3 in world exports of clothing. Mainland China is number 4 in world exports of clothing, and Taiwan is number 6. So certainly, part of the success of the East Asian countries must also be ascribed to successful exporting in other commodity groups. And of course, in the case of Korea, there were also heavy industries coming up, steel, petrochemicals, like there were in Latin America. But undoubtedly, the biggest feature of the structural change in export composition of these countries by comparison with Latin America was this huge increase, huge world success in exports of ICT commodities. Okay, well, this meant that the East Asian tigers, each one of them now has exports, share of world exports comparable to the countries of the European Community. Singapore's share of world exports of these goods increased from 3% to 6%. South Korea from 2% to 5.5%. UK, France, Italy, Germany are either slightly below that level or not much above. So you now have a situation where the four tigers have a share of exports of the fastest growing commodity group in world trade, just about as big as the European Community. Again, a fantastic achievement in terms of catching up in world trade. Well, of course, it would be quite wrong to ascribe the success of the four tigers exclusively to one commodity group. I'm not suggesting that. Because even more important than success in the fastest growing new industries and technologies is the capacity to apply those new technologies to other sectors of the economy. So that it's certainly useful to be able to produce computers or fax machines or video recorders or color television which can compete in world markets. That's very useful because it's a hugely fast-growing market. But even more important, of course, is to be able to use computers, software, other electronic goods in other parts of the industrial and service industries. To use them in process control, to use them to improve all kinds of manufacturing processes, to use them in market research, to use them in company organization, communication, to use them everywhere throughout the economic system. So if you look at that diffusion of information technology throughout the economic system, and you try to get indicators for strength in diffusion of that technology across the economic system, then the first thing you have to look at, of course, is the new infrastructure. And the new infrastructure is the telecommunication infrastructure. This, everybody agrees who's looked at it, especially our PICS group here in Sprue, you, Michael, and Robin, and others, have looked a great deal at the telecommunication infrastructure in Europe, in Singapore, in other Asian countries, in Japan. And we all know, also from the work of Italian economists like Antonelli, that the externalities generated by an efficient telecommunication infrastructure are enormously important. if you compare what happened in Eastern Europe with what's happening in East Asia, you can see the point. The lack of an adequate telecommunication infrastructure is a critical handicap for the East European countries. And one of the first things that they have to do to get back to anything like a competitive situation in the world economy is to strengthen their telecommunication infrastructure in that part of the world. The Japanese regional policy within Japan stresses telecommunications as the key to regional industrial policy. If you're going to get firms to locate in a certain region of a country, you have to assure them of a good telecommunication infrastructure. It's important not only, obviously, for worldwide marketing networks and communications. That's one reason why Singapore and Hong Kong are so strong in this area. It's also important for internal communication within firms, between locations. We all know the growing importance of these telecommunication-based networks in R&D, manufacturing, marketing, all these functions, and in every service industry like financial services. So that to get a good telecommunication infrastructure is essential to successful industrial growth and export performance. So if you look at the main indicators of telecommunication infrastructural development, again, you get a very striking difference between Latin America and East Asia. Mike Hobday, in his thesis on telecommunications in Brazil, pointed out Brazil was actually quite well ahead in the early days of digitalization of the telecommunication network in that country. And if you look at what's happened since in Brazil, then you get a much worse picture. If you look at number of telephone lines per person in some of the principal Latin American, East Asian, and European countries, you find that Brazil is now near the bottom of the list. 6 telephone lines, I'm sorry, I don't know what this damn thing is, it's up to, six telephone lines, it should be per 100 people. I'm sorry, this is wrong, me title. 6 telephone lines per 100 people, compared with 7 in Colombia and Malaya, 24 lines per 100 people in Korea, 34 lines per 100 people in Singapore, 39 UK, 39 Japan. And if you look at the expenditure at the sales of terminal equipment using the telecommunication infrastructure, the difference is even greater. $10 US per capita sales in Brazil, 77 in Korea, 235 in Singapore, i.e., the telecommunication infrastructure has developed much more rapidly and much more favorably in all the East Asian tigers than in Latin America. So that Latin America has fallen far behind in the availability of efficient telecommunication services compared with East Asia. The leading countries in East Asia are catching up with or have already overtaken European countries like the UK. And this is 1988. The thing is still going ahead extremely rapidly in the East Asian countries. So you had in the East Asian countries a modernization and a massive investment in the key infrastructure for this new technology, which was lacking in Eastern Europe, in Latin America, or other parts of the developing world. Okay, well, that's one part of the infrastructure. That's the infrastructure which is essential for doing business in new ways with new commodities in new markets. But of course, that's not the only kind of infrastructure that's essential for economic development. Luke Sitter and Carlota Perez, in the chapter they wrote for the book edited by Giovanni and others, Technical Change in Economic Theory, had a chapter where they said that when there's a change of techno-economic paradigm, as in the change from energy-intensive types of oil-based mass production towards computerized systems, information technology, and the telecommunication infrastructure, that when you have a change of that magnitude affecting all kinds of industries and services in every country, when you have that kind of a change, then that creates a window of opportunity, as they called it, for catching up countries. They were very careful to say this doesn't mean that every underdeveloped country has a chance immediately to get on the bandwagon of a new technology. Far from it. It's extremely difficult to get through this window of opportunity. And among the conditions necessary to take advantage of that kind of big change in world technology are the existence of a very strong education, science, technology infrastructure. It's only if you have enough skilled people capable of assimilating, using, adapting, improving these new technologies, applying them in new ways, that you can use this window of opportunity. So Carlota and Luke said in this paper, which I still think is a very good account of the catching up problem in the 1980s, they said that those countries which take advantage of this opportunity will be those who have already shown capability in catching up in older industries, which of course the East Asian countries did, as the Latin American countries did also, in industries like petrochemicals in the case of Korea, shipbuilding in the case of Korea, and in the case of steel industry, Brazil and Korea. They had already shown capability in catching up in older established technologies. But to break into the new technologies, as well as catching up in older technologies, that requires an even stronger, obviously, an even stronger scientific and technical capability. And this means two things. One, at the level of the enterprise, as Martin Bell and Keith Pavitt have shown so well in their paper for the World Bank, and in much else that Martin's done on third world development. The capability at the enterprise level to improve upon imported technologies or domestic technologies is absolutely fundamental for any successful growth process. It's not a spontaneous process that's simply doing something you learn by repetition. It requires a systematic effort at enterprise level to improve productivity, and not only by research and development, although that becomes more and more important, but by a variety of other technical activities, which unfortunately, because the Frascati definitions only got as far as R&D, and the rest of the scientific and technical activities essential for improving economic performance were left on one side. We don't have measures of all these other things like production engineering, information services, testing, standardization, market research, 101 other things which are also important for improving productivity at the level of the enterprise. So you have to have the skills available at the level of the enterprise to do all these things. That means you have to have good general education systems, and not just graduate education, but primary, secondary, the whole lot. It means high quality labor force throughout the economic systems. And where it's not up to the mark of what's required, and anyhow to specialize in particular technologies, that has to be accompanied by retraining, by extra training at the enterprise level. And as in both clothing and electronics, you have a very high rate of product change and of introduction of new designs. You have to have enough flexibility at all levels in the workforce to cope with those rapid changes of design, whether they're fashion-induced or technology-induced. The capability to cope with rapidly changing product mix and market outlets is essential. And that means a well-educated and trained labor. Well, one of the most striking things about the literature that I've seen on East Asia, and people here know more about this than I do, But one of the most striking things I read was in Alice Anston's description of training for a new steel plant in Korea, where people were training to operate the line before it was even there on the ground. They were learning how to do it. So that you couldn't get a more vivid example of training accompanying new investment in plant and machinery. So this is essential for success in overtaking and catching up. High level of general education plus specialized training, retraining, all the time, continuous education and training at enterprise level. And this seems to be an area where the East Asian countries, like Japan before them, have had tremendous success. And if you look at the South Korean situation, you can see the kind of thing I'm talking about. Literacy going from very low levels, 22% literacy in 1953, and that's important to remember. They started from a very low level up to something approaching 100% by 1987. Secondary education also going to near 100% levels. College education, tertiary education, covering more than a quarter of school leavers by 1987, which is better than many European countries. So that progress in the general educational level, and although they're not quite so impressive, the figures for Singapore and Hong Kong are similar, and for Taiwan, perhaps they're even better. So that is characteristic of the East Asian countries, very high achievement in general education of the population, primary, secondary, and tertiary. So they now have a very high output of fairly well-educated, qualified people. But within that overall achievement, which is the World Bank Development Report now acknowledges in its 1991 report, that educational level is a vital ingredient of the development process. And as far as I know, it's the first time the World Bank has given explicit recognition to the idea that intangible investment in education and technology is just as important as investment in physical capital, plant and machinery. And that has also to allow for the fact that you want to have a particularly high number of people in engineering. And if you look at the graduate output from the East Asian countries, you find they are now producing, as a percent of their population, more engineers and scientists than Japan. All three, South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, have a considerably higher number of graduate engineers in proportion to population than Japan has. And we all know that Japan has more than most of us in Europe or the United States in proportion to their population. So you have both high general achievements in educational system, plus a lot of good enterprise level training and retraining, plus a high proportion of engineers within the total output of graduates from the educational system. That means that they were able, because of that infrastructure, to satisfy, not completely of course, but to satisfy to a considerable extent the need for skilled people, not only in the electronic industry, as important though they were, but in the applications of computers and electronic systems in many other industries and services. So that, for example, in Singapore, as far as I know, it's the only country in the world where they actually made it compulsory, rather than draconian measures, for small businesses to use up-to-date equipment in telecommunications and computing as a condition of operating their businesses. That's the degree of pressure they've put in these countries to adopt new information and communication technology on the basis of the skills that are available through the education system. Well, the World Bank emphasizes mainly education in its 1991 report, and I certainly wouldn't dispute that, and I think that all of us that have been involved in these kinds of problems are completely agreed about the importance of investment in education. However, I would dispute the World Bank's emphasis in its 1991 report on import of technology. They say, I think rightly, that one of the advantages of having a high-quality education system is alertness to what's happening outside the country, openness to new developments in world markets and world technology. I think that's perfectly true, not disputing that. But I don't agree that the import of technology is the only way, or the main way, in which development takes place on the basis of those educational achievements. Because what they leave out, I think, still in their analysis, is the role of scientific and technical services, including research and development, at the enterprise level. And if you go back to this transparency showing educational achievements in South Korea, the bottom part of it is showing numbers of corporate R&D laboratories, and it goes from only one industrial R&D laboratory in the whole of South Korea in 1970 to 455 industrial R&D laboratories in 1987. Well, some of you may suspect, as I would, that there's a bit of fiddling in the figures, not in the sense of deliberate dishonesty, but in the sense that firms cottoned on to the idea that they could reclassify some activities as R&D as that became popular, and as the government began to give more tax incentives, interest rate incentives to develop industry-level R&D. So maybe there's a bit of inflation in that figure, going from one industrial R&D lab to 450 in a very short space of time. But behind it is undoubtedly an absolutely real achievement. And this is one of the main differences between Latin America and East Asia, that in East Asia, especially in South Korea, but also in Taiwan and the other countries, they have succeeded in shifting the biggest part of R&D to enterprise level, i.e. more than 60% now of R&D scientists and engineers and R&D expenditures in Taiwan and in South Korea is in the enterprises. This doesn't mean that government and university R&D stopped growing. They went on growing. But industrial R&D grew fastest of all. So that whereas the East Asian countries typically now have the main part of their research and development at enterprise level, which is where it's needed to develop successive new generations of products and improvements in process technology right through the system, in Latin America still typically only 20 or 30% of total R&D is at enterprise level. Most of it is still in government and university laboratories. Well, that's fine. You need it in government and university laboratories. But for a successful process of catching up in Latin American countries, there will need to be, and also in Eastern Europe for that matter, it's been one of the main structural problems of the R&D system in Eastern Europe, there will need to be a shift to enterprise-level scientific, technical activities, including, of course, R&D, as technologies become more complex and more advanced. So the infrastructure then is not only, as the World Bank rightly says, education, it is also an R&D infrastructure. And that means a combination of effective public laboratories where they're needed, and they are needed in many areas, in standards, in agriculture, in information technology, in dissemination activities, in health activities, in combating pollution, which is not the strongest point of East Asia, many East Asian countries. In all those kind of areas, public laboratories are essential. So you need a public network of scientific and technical infrastructure. You certainly also need, as Keith has shown, I think, so well in his recent work, you need strong basic research. And you need the basic research, as Keith has shown, not just to write more papers, that may be important, of course, and not just so as to achieve some prize in international scientific competition. You need basic research above all as a window for world science and technology in order to be able to assimilate the findings of world science and use them fruitfully in any national economy. So basic research is certainly a very important part of the infrastructure for any catching up country. So you certainly need a national network of R&D laboratories, university laboratories, and as part of that network, you need a rapidly growing industrial R&D network. If you look at, again, the South Korean R&D network, you'll see that they have now overtaken most European countries in terms of R&D as a fraction of GNP. Of course, GNP is still much more in South Korea than in countries like Britain, France, or Germany. So I'm not suggesting they've overtaken in absolute terms the level of European countries. But as a proportion of the smaller GNP, the South Koreans are now above the 2% level and coming up to the level of most other European countries or surpass it. Taiwan is also coming up very close behind, very steep in R&D as a fraction of GNP. The Koreans have a target. We are amazed if they reach it, but they have a target of 5% of GNP on research and development. I mentioned this not because I think they will achieve it, but I mentioned it to indicate the kind of goals that they set in their technology policies and their economic policies. Okay, well, R&D, of course, it's fine to have R&D, but it doesn't necessarily generate technical change or improvement in products and processes. It has to be largely at enterprise level to do that anyway, and even then it doesn't always achieve that objective. So obviously you want high quality R&D, you want R&D which is very close to what is being done in the production process. You want people who understand the requirements of markets. And for all those things, of course, the organizational model of business, the way that business is conducted, is extremely important. And I'm certainly hoping that Mike Hobday in his project will throw a great deal of light on those things. It's my hypothesis, and it's only a hypothesis, my guess is that the East Asian countries have found it easier to follow Japanese management models in their organization on technical change at the enterprise level. Partly because of direct investment by Japanese firms in these countries, and that's been rising very steeply indeed in the 1980s, partly because of technology transfer, partly because of consultancy. They told me in Tokyo that the busiest plane by far on Japanese airlines is the one that goes to Seoul at the weekend because it's full of consultant engineers going to Korea. So whatever may be the methods, and I don't know what they are, I think it's an important subject for research, and I hope Mike find out a lot of interesting data on this. I think it's highly probable that the Japanese models of R&D organization are increasingly influential in these countries. And most interesting of all, perhaps, is that just recently, this growth in R&D, the success in new commodity groups in trade and production, is beginning to be reflected also in numbers of patents taken out. Well, again, we all know the limitations of patent statistics. We know the problems with patent statistics, and we know they only give a very rough guide. And in fact, Jan Fagerberg, when he made his model of the relationship between level of technology, rate of growth, and rate of physical investment on plant and capital, he was rather puzzled because he found the East Asian countries didn't have the amount of patenting that he had expected would be the case. But in fact, if we take the last year or two, unfortunately, it might be 9, but I would bet anybody that the 1990 and 1991 figures, when we get them in our data bank, show an equally big trend of increase. You have South Korea and Taiwan now really shooting up in numbers of patents and going far ahead of the Latin American countries in numbers of patents taken out in the United States. And again, we're familiar with the reasons for using that measure, patents taken out in the United States rather than other measures of patent performance. So whereas Latin American countries, with the exception of Brazil, have had a pretty flat level of patenting over the last 10 years and a very low level of patenting, the East Asian countries, starting again from a much lower level in most cases, are now zooming up very fast indeed in numbers of patents, especially as was true of Taiwan. So what I'm trying to argue is that the success of the East Asian countries has been due to the fact that they were able to adapt to the fastest growing new commodity groups in world production, in world trade. They were able to produce and export those commodities on a very large and rapidly growing scale of the 1980s. They were able also to apply those technologies elsewhere because of the availability of a highly skilled workforce based on achievements in general education and in science technology infrastructure. So the last couple of points I want to make is one, a general comparison. I couldn't do it for all these countries, but just for Brazil and South Korea as the two biggest countries involved in those regions, leaving out mainland China for the moment. And you'll see, on all these things I've been talking about, the percentage of people in tertiary education 3 times as high in Korea as in Brazil. Literacy also, by the way, is something where Korea is far ahead of Brazil. Primary level of education. Engineering students as a proportion, even higher, 4 times as big in Korea as in Brazil. R&D as a percent of GNP, 3 times as high in Korea as in Brazil. Industry R&D as a proportion of the total, 2/3 in Korea, less than 1/3 in Brazil. Now looking at diffusion of information technology through other parts of the economy. Robots per million employment, 20 times as high in Korea as in Brazil, despite the fact that Brazil has done rather well in automobiles and in machine tools. The diffusion has been far greater in South Korea than in Brazil. CAD per million employment, 3 times as high Korea as in Brazil. Numerically controlled machine tools, or CNC tools, 2.5 times as high proportionately in Korea. Growth rate of electronics, 21% in the last 5 years in Korea, 8% in Brazil. Telephone lines per capita, I've already talked about, 100 people I talked about. Computers per percentage of GDP, one indicator where Brazil comes out rather well, but that was in 1985 or 87. It's changed drastically since then, because the Brazilian computer industry and users have grown very fast, whereas the Brazilian has leveled off or declined. Maybe Jose Vizia will say something more about that in the discussion. If you take a growth rate of the key sectors of electronics in Korea, you find the growth rate of computers was 33% per annum, 85 to 19, and the whole industry was growing at 21% per annum. This was the best period for Brazil, 83 to 87, only 8% growth. So it means the gap was widening all through the 1980s in the main lines of application of information technology right through the economic system. Well, I said that I think that these features of the success of East Asian countries amount to differences in the national system of innovation, and I tried to summarize them here. That the advantages of the East Asians are in continuous learning and retraining at the firm level, rapid changes in design and product mix, both in the clothing industry and in the electronic industry, in old and in new industries. All of that based on a high level of general education, plus a high proportion of engineers, high priority given in these countries to strategic industries and technologies, not only ICT, but importantly ICT. These priorities included subsidies, protection for a long time, in spite of what the neoliberals say, coordination at top level of government policies to promote these industries, low interest rates discriminating in favor of enterprises in these strategic industries, high investment in the telecommunication infrastructure, and major structural change in the composition of production and export. But you rightly would say, how could they achieve that politically? And I would agree with Robert Wade when he says it's not enough to show the changes in technology, in economic structure. You have to have a political explanation of what happened, what's the difference between East Asia and Latin America. I can't fully answer that question. You have to know a lot about the interest groups, the politics, the government structures, the civil service, respectively, in those different areas of the world. So I'm leaving that to discussion and research, but I was very interested to see that the Japanese have produced a paper in the World Bank which challenges the main neoliberal orthodoxy in the World Bank's policy. And this Japanese paper, an occasional paper which they contributed in the World Bank, strongly criticizes 4 points of the neoliberal orthodoxy about development. And it looks as though this criticism is based both on Japanese experience and on the more recent experience of Korea, Taiwan, and other Asian countries. What they say is, first of all, deregulation is not enough to generate growth. Secondly, trade liberalization, if it's based on static comparative advantage, can actually have a negative effect on development and growth. Thirdly, development finance institutions must be prepared to use special low interest rates to promote certain types of infrastructural development and strategic industries. Fourthly, privatization isn't a cure-all, and its application has to vary with the specific circumstances in each country. So that maybe the Koreans, this is what I'm saying, not what the Japanese paper says, maybe the Koreans were quite right to keep their telecommunication infrastructure right through the 1980s as a public monopoly, because that was the easiest way to get the high level of investment they wanted to get in that vital infrastructural system. So, okay, I wish I could say that that Japanese approach to development had become the accepted approach. I don't think it has, but I think that the main policy lesson to be learnt from this comparison of East Asia and Latin America is the tremendous importance of science, technology, infrastructure, along with education in the growth process, and the importance of moving strategically towards the key new technologies of the next phase of growth and having corresponding infrastructural policies and technology policies to achieve that goal. Well, as you said, Michael, I'd be really glad to get all kinds of comments and criticisms, because what I've been saying will be part of a joint paper with Giovanni at the International Economics Association in October. He's doing the hard part, relating it to growth theory. I'm doing the relatively easier empirical part, which I've been talking about, and we shall encounter the neoliberals and new growth before in their full strength. So I need a lot of ammunition, please, to help me, and I'll be especially glad for comments and criticism for those of you, and I see there are many here, who actually have lived and worked in these parts of the world.
And I must say, I found your detailed analysis most illuminating. Kind of detailed you went through with, I think, so socializing the economics of India, very through. I liked your particular point when you talked of education, and then you talked at enterprise level of R&D. And am I right in assuming that you therefore were in favor of inhibiting the wholesale import of technology, because in that that's the disincentive to domestically grow R&D. And I say this in the context of what's happening in India right now. In response to World Bank vision and ambition, we are going into this business of opening up in order to get globalized with technology. And yet we have one of the best, at least it's developing countries, a good R&D structure. So would you also say that for some protectionism in importing technology in order to be competitive in the world is something were you hinting at that? Am I right in thinking that you did state something on the tech side?
Well, I think what I would say, I don't know too much about India, very little. In general, I would say that it's one of the things that's come from simplified transaction cost economics is to pose the question as a choice. Either you import technology or you do your own. One theoretical method, one might attempt to buy the technology or produce it hierarchically in your own establishment. I think it's not like that at all. That is a false dichotomy. I think, on the contrary, that Japanese experience especially, but also I think Korean experience, demonstrates import of technology and indigenous R&D are not alternatives, but are complementary activities. I.e., you cannot import technology successfully and use it effectively and improve it and modify it to meet local conditions unless you have some in-house technical capability, which may not be formal R&D, it may be production engineering, other engineering capabilities, may be a variety of different things. And Jorge Katz showed, I think, very well in Argentina and other Latin American countries the importance of non-R&D types of technical activity in enterprises. So not only R&D, but increasingly R&D as the technologies have become more complicated. So you need the in-house R&D in order to be able to import the technology and use it effectively. So they're not alternatives, they are complementary. As to whether it's better to concentrate mainly on indigenous R&D, I think that I would absolutely agree with you that every country needs its own in-house scientific technical infrastructure and R&D capability. That's for sure. You shouldn't have policies which destroy that network or reduce it or weaken it. They should be strengthening that capability all the time. But I don't think that means that you always will make a choice of indigenous development rather than imported technology. Rather, you'll try and get the best both by that process of using them simultaneously. So I would pose it more in terms of the complementarity of own R&D and technology import, always looking out for the best, always trying to improve your own, and trying to combine the two most effectively in your own special circumstances.
Thank you. Just want to say how useful with analysis plus that Japanese kind of position paper in somebody UK would be for countries like India from going into internationalization. And frankly.
I'll take Nick next. I mean, if you could, during the course of the question and answer, if you could indicate to me, I'll make a note of people's name and try and make a good judgment of someone I can get through through. Nick, would you like to come next?
Well, in somewhat similar vein, you're talking, Chris, about the telecoms infrastructure and so forth. I wondered there whether you were making an argument for what was sometimes alleged of railroads in the 19th century, building ahead of demand, whether you're putting down something ahead of the needs of business, etc., in order to allow it to expand, to take advantage of it, and whether perhaps that's even feasible for, say, a genuine Latin American country to do that.
Well, at the level of personal household use of telephones, I think one of the big problems with Latin America, especially Brazil, I mentioned, as Mike Hobday showed, they actually got in quite early with digitalizing and developing quite an advanced network in Brazil. The problem was the income distribution in Brazil is so unequal that most people simply can't afford any kind of telecom service. Whereas the East Asian countries, as Andrew Talcott showed in his book, East Asian countries, although they're certainly not free and equal societies, they do have actually a more equitable distribution of income than most Latin American countries.
So it meant that many more households could afford to install telephones. We had telephone services of various kinds. Additional terminal equipment, they could afford that, whereas in Latin America they were stuck at this very low level of use of telephone equipment by households. So certainly I think that this was one of the big differences. Whether they built ahead of demand in East Asia, perhaps somebody will work after that. I would have thought that demand pretty well kept pace with that very high rate of expansion. But I might be wrong. Maybe they did go ahead of demand. You probably know, Mike. I was going to find you did people in Korea.
I think maybe a misnomer to talk about development ahead of demand, because that's a very contentious issue. I mean, some people would argue that AT&T in the United States built their network 5 building ahead of demand, but equally, because make a case that in fact they were constantly in a position of making sure that they had to catch up. And in fact, that's how they made sure that they were never over-strategizing things or their investment. And taking off smaller operators whenever it was possible to do so. In other words, let somebody else make the investment and take them on through predatory pricing whenever you could.
I think they're certainly saying very, very ambitious targets.
I was just going to say that in Korea, there's a further factor that my information is correct. They virtually give the service away in a lot of cases.
I don't think so. Again, people know more than I do. But my impression from looking at the charges was that they actually financed a higher proportion of their new investment in Korea from charges to consumers to users. And that was the case in Brazil. That's better than me. It's not very good information. If anyone knows more, please say something. I'm not taking it.
Very cool.
This is related to the first question we have just asked, and it's again to do with keeping in mind the Indian conflict. We say that the training and the building up of an SFC infrastructure at the national level and at the Middle East from it, perhaps several important parts as we were going developing peace. Is this complementary to, or is it substitutable with public investment? And as a policy implication, and if a government has limited funds, that what is the policy implication exactly?
Well, as I said, I don't know enough about Indian situation. And what I do know is based on very old information from Stefan Dedichier and his colleagues in Lund University, who made a long time ago comparisons of the Indian R&D system with China and with other third world countries. And from what I remember of their work, and from a few bits of scraps information I picked up since, their position was that the greater part of R&D in India was in the public infrastructure and not in the enterprises. And that meant, according to their analysis, that although the level of science and technology was rather high in many Indian laboratories, and I think that was also the experience of the field work that Biglitz brewed in India, high quality of research, it didn't get into enterprise level production and trade. So that there was a problem, as there was in all the East European countries, including the former Soviet Union, are strong R&D in government institutes or in industry-wide institutes, but not linking up with enterprise-level process technology and product technology. And that seems to be, as far as I know, still a critical weakness of the Indian system. I mentioned that South Korea and Taiwan, each in different ways, succeeded in accelerating, only recently in the 1970s and 80s, the growth of enterprise-level R&D. One laboratory to 450 in the case of Korea. Tremendous change. And I've asked lots of people how they did that. And the answers I get are mainly low interest rates for certain types of investment, subsidies for certain types of R&D programs, tax advantages, again, for various types of R&D, these kind of financial incentives. But Kim, who did the paper on the Korean National System of Innovation for Ding Nelson's project, conferring what in its national assistance, Kim says, when I asked him, In fact, the political method was the main method by which they changed the behavior of the firms. I.e., it was political pressure on the firms from top level in government, do it or else. That was a kind of real high pressure on the big firms, especially the big four, also others, to expand their industrial R&D. So it seems to be the combination of economic, political, social incentives and pressures that brought about that shift. But in the East European countries, although from the 1960s onwards, they recognized this as one of the weaknesses of their system, and they tried a whole series of reforms, it looks as though they never really achieved that shift in their R&D systems to the main emphasis at enterprise level, except perhaps in the aircraft industry where it was rather successful. And as far as I know, and it's not very far, India has still that same problem to some degree.
Okay. I think it's going to be difficult to try and get some sort of continuous debate because there's so many people actually ask questions. I can't read things. So can we keep questions short and we'll try to get through as much as we can? So if people have Steve next, and then Eric in the back, and then Ben, and then George. Okay.
Chris, I wonder if you could comment a little bit more about the through such artistic framework of this. I mean, just thinking about what we see in the news about Thailand, South Korea. I've recently been to Singapore and found it very homogenous to approach to society, and Japan similarly. Isn't that going to be one of the vulnerable areas of your thesis to the sort of critique of the neoliberals in terms of how you marry in your economic analysis, which you just presented, with the socio-fiscal background to those countries, and how do you sort of project that will go?
Well, you're right. I don't know much about it at all, and I'll only make a couple of comments, which is based on many things that people like Robert Wade and Alice Sampson have said much more comprehensively and with much greater knowledge. First of all, it does seem to be the case that, as in Japan, the, whatever you call it, the civil service has greater autonomy, greater status, and better qualifications in most of the East Asian countries than in most Latin American countries. It has a certain high standing. The bureaucracy, in other words, has its own ethos, and it seems to be not quite so corrupt. And although obviously the Japanese at the top level is completely corrupt. Most of the politicians are corrupt. And although it may be the Brazilian president's corrupt, I don't know. If you believe he's a younger brother, he's very corrupt. That may be a false accusation, I don't know. But certainly it seems to be possible to have people at the top level in a country thoroughly corrupt, as in Britain in the 19th century, of course, also. And we were doing fine as hell. Possible to have that if you've got people at intermediate levels who are more or less doing an honest, efficient job. And it does seem to be the case, according to these different people who've looked at these systems, that civil service, lower levels of civil servants, whether they're in MITI or in the equivalent ministers elsewhere, seem to be rather hard-working, well-informed, conscientious, fairly well-qualified people, and may have the occasional corruption, but who on the whole do a thorough, good job and are motivated by a vision or a perspective of what the country could become. So that's one thing which I think is important, and I'd like to see a lot more work on the Latin American civil services and how they perform and what kind of people they recruit and how they compare in their ethos and their style of governance with the East Asian countries. But I think that may be one of the political, social, institutional differences. The second thing I already spoke of, which is the income distribution, which I think is extremely important, that it's very unequal in most Latin American countries. It's much more equal in the East Asian countries. And that, I think, plus the level of general education, means you have more people in East Asia capable of taking a more informed, independent view. And it's interesting that the Prime Minister of Malaya, Lee Kuan Yew, although he's been an autocrat for a long, long time, and they've had a rather authoritarian style of government, according to The Economist magazine, about a year ago, they had an interview with him, and he said in that interview that to operate the new technologies, we have to have more democracy. It may be hypocritical, I don't know. Maybe it can be hypocritical. But I think that there is a recognition in all those countries, I think I said in Thailand very strongly now, that as you have technology which require the intelligent participation of large numbers of people at enterprise level, including the shop floor workers, if they're taking a responsible part, as they are, according to people like Alice Epstein, in changing the production system, that must be reflected sooner or later in the approach to politics as well. And the more crude types of military governance will tend to be at a disadvantage. So that's the second aspect of the problem. The first thing is the fact that these countries had strong land reforms in the immediate period after the Second World War. These Asian countries, I mean, Japan had General MacArthur, and the East Asian countries all had, for various reasons, pretty thorough land reform. And that meant that the big landowners ceased to be what they had been before, a very powerful influence on all kinds of policy. They still are a very powerful influence in many Latin American countries, and that has a very negative effect on the forms of growth, the direction of growth, especially in Argentina. You can see this. Argentina was one of the most developed countries, comparable to Europe in many ways 50 years ago. I mean, they were developing aircraft, God knows what, in the times of peril 50 years ago. But it's really been a case of backwards, developing backwards as far as they're concerned. And I think part of it is that social structure factor and the link to natural resources as the main interest of the most powerful groups. So I think those are among the possible explanations of the balance of interest groups, the kind of coalitions of popular forces which might change direction of political and social development, and why it's been rather more favourable in most of these Asian countries, and I think will become more favourable. Whereas in Latin America, although they've also, I'm very glad to say, mostly abandoned and overthrown military regimes, there are very unfortunate signs of a return in some cases, particularly in Venezuela, but mainly because of the extreme inequality of the income distribution and the decline, absolute decline in per capita incomes, in which it's very hard to sustain social and political progress. Eric?
You use the example of Korea a lot, and I know a bit about this. And I think what is really important to stress in the case of Korea is that before R&D education, all this stuff came manufacturing first and export. It was really manufacturing for export during the 60s. And I think that all the problems that they have to solve were coming from manufacturing and their willingness always to increase that output. And what I think is dangerous to say we should increase R&D. I think it's not something that we can say alone. We have to increase R&D in order to improve the manufacturing process. But if we don't stress that enough, this R&D could all be lost, and this is the case in many developing countries. So I think this is important to stress for Alpha Academy. And when I was looking at your data, I found something interesting, because you're stressing the investment in telecommunication networks and all of this. Singapore had the largest investment, and it had the largest proportion of manufacturing of ICT goods as well. And yet it had the lowest growth rate in Asia. So do you think that Singapore went into a decreasing return?
On the first point, you're right. And I'm sorry, I didn't mean to get the impression there's only R&D that matters. I'm emphasized very strongly, I agree completely with Martin, that it's a lot of other activities at enterprise level that matter as well as R&D. I would agree with you that in the early stages, there were hardly any form of R&D. I said one R&D laboratory in 1970 in the whole of South Korea. So obviously that wasn't a big thing before 1970. You're quite right. But I do think that technical change was important even in that early period. And I think the approach of Korean management to manufacturing and the way that they went to export markets was strongly influenced, even then, by the desire to get better products and new products in the clothing industry and in other industries where they were then highly successful. So I agree, it wasn't just R&D, it was a lot of other technical activities, and they were more important in the early period. The reason that I concentrated on R&D and showed this big growth in the 80s was that I was trying to explain what happened in the 80s. I said that up till this 1970, Latin America was pretty well keeping pace. And when people talked about the NICs before 75, they always meant Brazil, Mexico, as well as Korea and Taiwan. That was the NICs. It was Latin America and East Asia. It's only in the 1980s you've had this huge divergence. And if you're looking at that process and the growth of new industries in Korea in the 1980s, then I think formal R&D at enterprise level has been more and more important in Korea. And I absolutely agree with you. It would be wrong to read from that that's what leads in Africa or in any other developing country. It's all related to the level of development, the industrial structure, the infrastructure, all these things. It's a complicated thing. And I would argue that both Taiwan and South Korea have now gone to a path where that industrial in-house R&D is increasingly important. And they couldn't get things like 16 megabit chips without that.
But this R&D is made in the US.
That's a pretty big generalization.
If we look at the case of Samsung, who's the leading trouble in Korea, all its R&D for leading is the leading edge technology. They started with 2055 56 kilobyte chips, and even though they've been saying that now they're opting for indigenous development, all these things are still created in their laboratory in Silicon Valley with American science. And this is important, I think, with Korea. Then the leading trouble are using that because they buy their products. They're not so interested in developing the product than manufacturing process. And this is
well, we have a graduate student here who worked in Samsung's R&D laboratories.
Yes, I see.
No, don't have this guy.
He could really throw light on that question. I've only talked to him thoroughly once, but I didn't quite get the impression that he didn't me. Oh,
Samsung wouldn't say that in news.
I would also say that it used to be always said about Japan, it was just American or European technology. They could just imitating, they were just importing. It seems to me that you could not do things like this. Just one generation of chips, maybe you recruit American scientists, but to keep it up with successive generations, then there must be some legitimate. I think that I agree you can argue about the proportion of import, the contribution of immigrant scientists, whether they were Koreans working in the US who came back, whatever. But it seems to me that it would be extreme to write it off as simply American R&D. That's what's the kind of... Oh, sorry, there was another question on Singapore. The Singapore high level of exports, this includes re-exports. Exports and re-exports. And it's not all Singapore manufacturing. It means that Hong Kong and Singapore have flourished partly as entrepot centers for the whole of the East Asian network. So it's partly their own indigenous manufacture, it's partly re-exports of other people's electronic components, assemblies, etc., etc. So it's both those things. And as to why they have a slower rate of growth, or whether they, and the role of manufacturing and so on in Singapore, you have to take into account that they have a per capita GNP now twice as high as Korea. And so they're already at a much higher level of per capita GNP. And also the fact that the services, financial services, entrepot services, all kinds of services are extraordinarily important in the Singapore economy. So it's a very special case where the telecommunication structure is absolutely vital to their service type of activities and all their entrepot activities.
Ben, if I could just take Matthew first. Sorry, as regards the
of copying R&D actually done in America by South Korean firm. A book by Jeffrey Haverso called Globalization of R&D explains the process of doing R&D by the old dragons. And he clearly, in the case of South Korea, he makes clear that indeed, yes, the first generations, the first chips produced in South Korea were literally copied from knowledge got via Silicon Valley in America. However, after a certain amount of years, they started producing their own R&D in South Korea itself. So actually, you're correct there that after a while they start doing their own R&D without copying other countries indeed. Could I just have a very little question? If you attack the neoliberals by what you found, that's maybe very interesting, but wouldn't be at the other side the conclusion about what you said here be very gloomy, or notably Eastern European countries, because the example of 4 NICs or dragons, all 4 countries not being very democratic, to put it diplomatically. I mean, Eastern Europe, they're just in the process of democratization. Would you say to them, go back to a period of authoritarian dictatorship? Because that's the best way to develop your economic base.
Yeah.
Well, first of all, on the Korean still, as I understand it, on the 16 megabit chips, the latest generation, which is just coming from the prototype stage into production. So as I understand it, I believe NEC are number 1, Deutsch, Fujitsu number 2, and Samsung number 3. And not American firms or European firms. Maybe wrong, but that's what's thought for people in the industry. So that doesn't signify being behind, I would say. And I only wish a Europe we had firms which could do what Samsung have done. So I'm not convinced by the argument that they are just doing American things. But anyway, leave that. Leave Korean R&D and chips and whatnot. And we come to authoritarian rule. It seems to me it's not a question of authoritarian rule getting results. I think it's a question of how efficient a particular bureaucracy is in achieving technical and economic goals. And I think that you have the curious result that in communist China, they've actually been very successful. In southern China, according to The Economist and a lot of other analyses. And I didn't show all the statistics, but they have in most cases just as high rates of growth as the East Asian tigers. And I think for similar reasons in most cases. So it's not, doesn't seem to be just what political system you have, but whether you have the mix of policies and the kind of people at intermediate levels and lower levels in the bureaucracy who are capable of understanding and implementing development and technological goals. And my view would be the opposite, that you have to go towards less and less authoritarian systems, because I think authoritarian systems are increasingly unacceptable to the very large numbers of people who have to bring about technical change and new generations of equipment in all these different industries and services. So, contrary to C.P. Snow, C.P. Snow argues in his book Science and Government that fascist Germany was just as efficient as democratic US or Britain in science and technology. I think he was wrong. I think they weren't as efficient. They had a short-term heritage based on past achievements of German science and technology, so they could develop rocket weapons and all kinds of weapons in the Second World War by very tough priorities for German science military technology. But I would say that the emigration of a lot of their best scientists, physicists, first of all, I think certainly that they failed to see that the atom bomb was not worth. But secondly, I think that certainly they would have fallen well behind if they had continued with that system of lack of initiative at lower levels, authoritarian ideological governance from above. And the same with the Soviet Union. One of my members is visiting Lysenko's laboratory in 1951 with a group of British biologists. And first of all, he wants me to put a dye on Bad enough in itself. Secondly, he simply was not willing to listen to scientific evidence produced by the biologists, as he was obviously someone who wanted to impose an authoritarian line on biology, irrespective of the scientific evidence. So that's not very good for biotechnology. So I don't think that authoritarian systems in science, technology, business management, or political systems in the long run are more efficient. The very opposite. Which isn't to say that sometimes you may have democratic systems that are so corrupt and incompetent that they may lead to the opposite. I think that's the case in Venezuela today. Colonel Chavez, who tried to launch this military coup d'etat, is an extremely popular man in Venezuela. He came on television and he asked his compatriots who had taken over in the two biggest cities outside Caracas, he asked them to lay down their arms. Because the government, having failed in Caracas, they asked him to stop the uprising. So he did. And everybody in Venezuela saw it about 10 times, repeating the message till he made a very good impression on the public. And he said, I ask you to lay down your arms. I thank you for your courage. Please stop por ahora, for the time being. And that was repeated by everybody all over the place, por ahora. And he's certainly an extremely popular national figure because he was prepared to shoot 100 people of the most corrupt who have been dominating their economic policy. That's the plain fact of it, that they have thoroughly corrupt people for a long time at the top. And they're the so-called impunidos, the people who've never been punished for gross corruption at the highest level. Well, if you have that in a democracy, that's not encouraging for democratic processes. So it's a question not only of democracy, but of what the democracies or the authoritarians do in practice. But in the long run, I would maintain, perhaps over-optimistically, that science and technology are favorable to more democratic systems in enterprises and in politics, and are inimical to authoritarian systems.
Okay. If we've got the stamina, I'd like to keep going to 4, so if people have to drift out, we could do. But can I also remind you, and Chris's request at the beginning, that we try and deal with some of the issues that his contacts when he gets to the conference are going to put him into. So if you think that you can help in that process, please make sure you get to ask your question.
Great. Occasionally, very occasionally, you will hear the seminar that changes fundamentally the way one looks. Well, in my case, I think I heard such a seminar as that. Before, I thought I knew about the 4 dragons. I thought I knew that they were 4 little countries doing interesting stuff in Southeast Asia, new technologies and so on, but still very small in economic terms. But the figures and the argument you put today, Chris, I mean, can see those 4 in an entirely different light. In relation not only to Latin America and other NICs, but also to the European community. On some of those indicators, you had those 4 dragons equivalent to the European countries. Just to pick out one of them, you had Hong Kong share of manufacturing export 3%, Britain 6%. Britain has 7 times the population, which incidentally knocks on the head the argument that government puts out with us having still having the highest manufacturing export share per head of population anymore. Now, you highlighted some of the reasons for that faster growth, taking advantage of that window opportunity to move into new technology-based industry, generating large exports in those industries, high-level education and straight into the workforce. And then took us on with the question of what are the policy implications of they finding what the government need to do to encourage those developments. In particular, what industrial strategy should they pursue? Now, I don't know much about the industrial strategies of the Quadrant, and you mentioned a little bit about the industrial politics of Singapore and of South Korea and some of those policies that you said, which also sounded quite draconian. I do know a little bit about Hong Kong, and I'm wondering if this fits your model. Hong Kong's very different. It doesn't have a government industrial strategy. It doesn't have a government educational policy. It doesn't really have a government at all. It's the nearest country I know to having no government. It has a few civil servants, a few British and Australian expats sitting around drinking, occasionally rousing themselves to play fold. But they're not corrupt, but they're certain they're lazy, basically. In addition, unfortunately, they have a very unequal income distribution. At the one end, you've got the subsistence farms in new territories, the Vietnamese boat and so on. At the other end, you've got the billionaires able to buy Canary Wharf after the pocket change. And you've got no democracy. So I'm not sure whether this fits your model so well, and I'm a bit worried that these neoliberal economists at this forthcoming meeting are going to quote Hong Kong and possibly Taiwan, I don't know about Taiwan, against you. So I wonder if you've got any further comments about what government policies are most effective, and in particular how at the moment fits your model.
Well, you're right. Very vulnerable point. There wasn't time, when I should have done some way to cover it, to deal with the fact that there's great diversity, both between the East Asian countries and the Latin American countries. And you can find exceptions to my generalizations in both continents. So you're right, Hong Kong is not at all the same kind of case as South Korea or Taiwan. I think Taiwan resembles South Korea more than Hong Kong. And you're right that Hong Kong can't be explained in just the same terms as South Korea, even Singapore. Hong Kong is very different. I think Hong Kong, the biggest thing is its relationship with China and its geographical position in relation to China at a time when Chinese contacts with the rest of the world were difficult for a variety of reasons. And so I think the entrepot role in relation to China and also the investment role, financial services role, is extraordinarily important in the case of Hong Kong. And a large part, I would say, of the 1980s success of Hong Kong is related to the 1980s success of South China and their role as an intermediary. And the export thing, of course, as I said with Singapore, is re-exports as well as exports. And so they are a tremendous re-exporting center from China and for other parts of East Asia, as well as export their own manufactured goods. But
But on that argument, wouldn't you expect Hong Kong to stay in the industrial sectors where China is strong, textile, critical manufacturing and so on, rather than moving into the high-tech one that it certainly hasn't done?
Yes, again, you're right. I don't know enough about the Hong Kong case to be able to argue the point as it should be argued. But I'll certainly accept your point that it is very different from the other three of the four tigers. And it does require some treatment in its own right, relating it, I think, to China very much.
Chris, I wanted to raise a point that make and something to do with your poor family's engagement with the neoliberal establishment. But first, I don't know what might have applaud the scope and clarity of the presentation. I know we managed to get through within an hour or less than an hour. As much as, and indeed more than, it takes me a whole term to get through it. But to get into the policy point, I think it is worth, it's important to emphasize again the point you rightly made, that the phenomenon that you were emphasizing was not only a 1980s phenomenon and not only a kind of IT electronics phenomenon. It was rooted in earlier periods. The East Asian economies built a significant technological dynamism into the successive phases of industrialization, into their light labor-intensive industrialization phase, then with greater difficulty and at greater cost, into the heavy and chemical industry phase, and then on top of all that, they built this greater, perhaps, but significant dynamic into the IT electronics phase. And I think it's actually at all three phases that one should be drawing the contrast with Latin America. I think to a much lesser extent did the Latin American economies build that kind of dynamic into their labor-intensive, simpler light manufacturing industry. To a much lesser extent did they do so as they entered into sort of heavy chemical, capital goodsy sorts of industries and so on. So it's a sequence of contrasts. And I think that is linked to, particularly, I think, the Korean policy process, where the debate between liberalization and protectionism and all of that is actually pointless. It precisely misses the essence of what was happening in Korea in particular, which was a manipulation of the policy apparatus in successive sequences and phases. I mean, they were highly protective of their labor-intensive industries, and then brought the pressures and whatever of liberal trade regimes to bear on that. They pursued the same manipulation and changing of the policy apparatus. They followed protectionist regimes, highly draconian, highly directive, and then switched it all and opened it up and left it to not left it to markets, but gave markets much greater influence on what was going on. So it was this ability to change the policy structure. And I suspect it's actually in that area that some of the key contrasts with Latin America are most pertinent. That you see that there was much less changing of the policy structure, much less manipulation, much less flexibility, much less variability in the way trade and other economic policies were brought to bear on the industrialization process. But having said that, I think once one knows that leads one straight back into all the issues that have been coming up about the nature of the political and bureaucratic basis of policy. There was a particular system, political and bureaucratic system, that enabled the Korean to manipulate, change, and flex policy between one end of the neoliberal spectrum to the far end of the protectionist spectrum, as it was appropriate at different stages.
Okay, very good. I think I agree with especially all of that. Just to add two things to really add to your points. The long period of coherence, obviously, in most of East Asian countries. First of all, higher education. That certainly began way back in 1950 and even earlier. And it was not because of the heritage of Japanese rule, according to my information. The level of higher education was very poor in 1940s in Korea and other countries that they occupied. And primary education, I think literacy was literacy dropped 22% because in 1940s. But that upward improvement in education at all levels, I think, was a constant right throughout areas. So I think that was one thing. It was very strong policy, pursued and systematically right the way through for 40 years. So that's one. Another thing I think that Mike Hopkins pointed out, I think he's quite right, is the export networks of the four tigers, and Alcott was important here too. The availability of trading networks worldwide and of business people accustomed to doing transactions all over the world, including the United States especially. Mike Hopkins points out that most of the biggest market share in exports is the US, not Japan. Japan is the main source of imports, but the US is the main export market. And those big export markets, the operation of large trading networks, absolutely essential, whether it's clothing, footwear, or petrochemicals, or later electronics. I think that's one of the very big differences between China and the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union never had a really good export network, and they didn't have people who were really good at that side on doing business. But Mike maintains, perhaps it's big exaggeration, but Mike Update maintains it's harder to market new products than to develop them. Oh, that may be this exaggeration, but it's certainly extremely hard to get good marketing at new products. And those trading networks, I think, were a constant, as you say. They developed much earlier in the 50s and 60s, but the experience gained in operating those trading networks, I think, was helped every industry as it came forward.
Sorry, Martin. So they weren't a constant. They were actually forced on Korean industry by the change of policy in the 60s. And up to the 50s, Korean industry policy structure was exactly the same as Latin America, inward-looking, highly protective, and so on. It was the demolition of that structure for those industries, not for all industries, but for those just about to be mature industries, that forced them into export market, forced them to build these networks of overseas marketing operations, and then the whole thing built up on top of that. It was that change in the policy regime.
Well, I gathered from Samsung that they had an export network, even getting back before the Second World War. But even that made an exceptional case. But I'm totally ready to accept your point about the big change in the 60s. But I think that the strength of export networks, I think Hong Kong and Singapore here have a key role in that whole complex of developments. And Hong Kong and Singapore were accustomed to that kind of role of entrepreneur middle people doing business all over the world. And that was a great help to all of them in achieving these equal goals. But I absolutely agree. The policy changes and the policy pressure, I'm sure, must have been extremely important to Nazi. I'd accept that. I fear that we should be going to half-time, not some conclusions.
Can I just take the one you asked question and then let's see where we are?
Thank you very much.
Okay. I was thinking to move the discussion about some kind of countries that it seems to me that they were not considered in your presentation, your discussion. I am thinking in the low-income developing countries. What can I do this country that has a very low qualified labor force, but they are abundant in this kind of production factor. They have a lot of natural resources, and also they have constraints, very typical and strong constraints, like they should pay a huge external debt. This means that they need to reduce the public apparatus in order to afford to do this payment. This means less money for investment in education, in health services, and things like that. Well, I am worried because in you, but also very interesting in your answer, because in your exposition you almost don't you don't give hopes to this country because they don't have this kind, for example, of labor force. That is very important in your point. A high level of labor force. They don't have future. They cannot invest. It seems to me something like that. That's something that I am worried about. Anyway, what can I do, this kind of countries? Perhaps it could be useful in your presentation because for a lot of these countries, the neoliberalism vision of the world could be useful because it says you must specialize in what do you have. You have natural resources, you have low levels of labor force, not qualified labor force. You can produce this kind of commodities, and after that, to try to become in a catching up economy.
That's welcome. You're absolutely right. I didn't cover those things at all. I didn't mean to represent what the East Asian countries have done as being the best solution for the world economy. Well, I could think of much better ways, ideally, the way the world could develop, which would take account of the fact that the poorest countries in Africa have suffered the most in the 19th century, and Latin America, especially in countries like Peru,
Bolivia,
catastrophic events, terrible conditions, and I agree with you, that's the most urgent problem. I wasn't talking, maybe I should have been talking about that, but I wasn't talking about the most urgent problem in terms of social justice and of the world's community of nations. You've been right, they should be the priority, the world community of nations. What I was talking about was something else, which is to try to explain what has happened, irrespective of the justice of it, what has happened in terms of the uneven development of the world economy. That one group of countries have zoomed ahead from being behind, and others have not stood still, but have been disadvantaged or sucked. I'm not trying to idealize that situation. I think it's a terrible situation. So I agree. Your question is the more important question. It would take more than a few minutes at the end of a seminar to answer it, but I think that is the question. It would take another seminar to deal with it. It would take a lot of good thought, and I don't know the answers to these problems of these countries. I can think of a few things, but to develop a strategy in a world which has changed because of the success of these Asian countries, the others can't do the same. I'm not suggesting at all that even Latin American countries like Brazil can imitate East Asia. I don't think they can. They are different countries, and they have to use their natural resource advantages It would be stupid to throw away the natural resource advantages. Those are extremely important: steel, paper, aluminium for Brazil, for Venezuela, for other Latin American countries. They are very, very important indeed, and even more so probably for African countries. So you're right, there has to be a different strategy, taking advantage of different resources, different levels of development, technology, and so on. And there has to be in the world community of nations a wholly different approach. I put up this Japanese descent thing precisely because I think that these countries cannot be simply thrown to the mercies of the world market. It would be a terrible solution. So you're absolutely right. That is the question in terms of world development. But I can't answer you now, I'm sorry. But I think Martin could give a lot of answers.